You think you understand how your own mind works. You make choices. You weigh options. You decide, fine, but why do you keep doing the thing you already decided not to do? Why does knowing not change what happens next? And what stops intention from becoming action? Most people don't ask. They say things like discipline, or motivation, or I just need to want it more. They repeat words, but that's not an answer. When you really ask why, you find something that changes how you see thinking itself. Not as reasoning, as a system with built-in shortcuts it can't escape. Let me show you. Start with something simple. You unlock your phone for one thing. One message. One quick check. 10 minutes later, you're somewhere else. Not because you chose 10 minutes, not because you planned it. It just happened. And here's the strangest part. You were there the whole time, watching it happen, and it still happened. Now here's the key. That gap you feel between what you meant to do and what you actually did is not random. It's not a character flaw. It's not a mysterious weakness. It's a structure, a layer in the mind that decides what becomes real before you can argue with it. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Most people carry a model of themselves that sounds like this. I think. I decide. I act. Thoughts first. Actions second. Like the mind is a control room. A clean dashboard. A steering wheel. You give the order. The body follows. That's the story. And it feels true because it feels intuitive. But watch what happens in real life. You sit down to work, you open the laptop, you're ready. Then you just check one thing, one tab, one update. And suddenly the whole session is different. Not ruined by a disaster, ruined by a drift, a small bend in direction that compounds. A notification, a thought, a click, and the day quietly becomes something else. You recognize the moment it starts, you even notice it. And somehow, noticing isn't the same as stopping. That's the gap, the space between intention and execution, the place where thinking is supposed to become behavior. And it's where people get trapped, because they think the solution is to think harder, to argue with yourself, to lecture yourself, to summon a stronger internal voice. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Your intention is not a command. It's a story you tell yourself about what will happen next. A prediction, a plan, a narrative. And narratives don't move muscles. Systems do. Now here's the part people resist, because it sounds like you're losing agency. But you're not losing it. You're seeing where it actually lives. Intention is slow, it's verbal, it's fragile, and it competes with something faster, something older, a system that doesn't argue, it doesn't persuade, it doesn't debate, it simply activates what's available. That's why the I decided feeling is unreliable, because by the time you feel it, the contest has already started. The cue is already here. The pattern is already worn. The next action is already closer than the alternatives. And the mind does what fast systems always do. It stops searching early. It takes the first option that feels good enough, not the best one. The one that closes the loop. The one that resolves the moment. Which means something brutal. The battle isn't between discipline and laziness. The battle is between search and closure. And your mind prefers closure. But weight intention isn't a command. So what's running the show? What is the thing that actually chooses what happens next? To answer that, we have to separate two things you keep blending together. Thinking and control. Because they feel like the same thing, but they're not. Here's a question that sounds simple until you try to answer it. When do you actually decide? Not when you think you decided. When does the decision happen in the chain of events? Does the decision happen first and then action follows? Or does action begin and then the feeling of deciding shows up afterward? Most people assume the first one because that's what it feels like. A thought appears, a choice is made, a movement happens, clean, linear. But in controlled experiments, something strange shows up. People can begin a movement subtly and quietly before they report. The moment they decided to move, the body starts, the mind reports, as if the decision arrives late, not as a driver, as a notification. This breaks the usual story, because if the action is already starting, conscious intention can't be the initiating force. Not always. Sometimes conscious thought is the commentary track. It narrates, it labels, it claims ownership, but it didn't necessarily pull the trigger. And if that feels impossible, notice what your mind does next. It tries to rescue control. It says, okay, maybe that experiment is weird. Maybe that only happens in labs. Fine. So let's leave the lab and watch the same mechanism in real life. Here's the simplest way to see it. Try to hold one thing in your mind while you do anything else. Not vaguely, precisely. Hold a short list. 4 things. Just 4. A name, a number, a place, a rule. Keep them all active at once. Now read a sentence, answer a question, make a choice. Watch what happens. The list collapses. Not because you're careless, not because you didn't try, because the system isn't built to hold that much in the spotlight. At any moment, conscious attention can hold only a few meaningful chunks, not dozens, not even 10, just a handful, roughly 4. And once you understand how narrow that spotlight is, you inherit a new problem. Because if attention can only hold a handful of things, then most of reality is always outside it. Not hidden, not unconscious in some mystical way, just unsurfaced, unselected. And here's the strange part. The mind doesn't feel like it's missing anything. In the moment, what you notice feels like the whole scene. You feel present, you feel aware, but you're not perceiving everything. You're perceiving the thin slice the system decided to render. That's why you can look directly at something and still not register it. Not because your eyes failed, because the selection layer didn't allocate the slot. And when something isn't selected, it's not ignored. It barely exists in your experience. It doesn't become part of the story, which means the mind isn't just choosing actions. It's choosing the world those actions will be based on. That's the illusion of control at its deepest level. You don't choose from reality. You choose from a simplified model of reality, created under time pressure, with a 4-slot spotlight, and a system that would rather move than verify. And then you call the output my decision. Now here's the bottleneck. Conscious thought is narrow. It's a tiny beam in a world that demands constant response. So the mind has a problem. Most of your life is too complex to be run manually. You can't consciously decide every step you take, every letter you type, every micro adjustment in a conversation. If you had to choose every move with full deliberation, you'd freeze. So the system does what any system under time pressure does. It automates, it compiles patterns, it builds defaults, and then it triggers them, which means something important. Most behavior is not chosen fresh each time. It's executed as pre-built sequences, triggered by context, A cue appears, a routine runs, not because you wanted it, because the pattern was ready. It was already there, and the cue lit it up. You don't decide how to walk, you just walk. You don't decide how to form each word, you just speak. You don't decide the exact muscle movements of reaching for your phone. Your hand moves and the story comes later. This is how fast systems work. Deliberation is slow, defaults are fast. So the mind defaults, over and over, quietly, automatically. And most of the time you don't notice, because it works, until it doesn't. Until the default leads somewhere you didn't plan. And then you feel the gap, and you call it failure. But wait, if you're defaulting, why does it feel like you chose? Why does it feel like I decided even when the system is running patterns? Because the mind does something even stranger after the fact. It manufactures reasons. Think about the last time you did something that surprised you. Not something dramatic, something small. You checked something you didn't need to check. You opened an app you weren't planning to open. You clicked something that didn't matter. And then you had a reason. Of course you had a reason. I was just seeing if there was an update. I needed to respond quickly. I wanted to clear it. I was looking for one detail. Notice what just happened. Action first, then explanation. And the explanation feels like it existed before the action, because the mind backdates it. It stamps the story onto the timeline as if it was always there. Here's a clean way to see how powerful that narration is. You think your reasons are anchored to your choices, but sometimes the mind will generate reasons even when the choice wasn't yours at all. In one kind of experiment, a person is shown two options, two images, two faces, two products. They point to the one they prefer. Simple. Then something strange happens. The experimenter secretly swaps the option. The person is handed the one they did not choose. And in a surprising number of cases, the person doesn't notice. They accept the swapped outcome as if it was their original choice. And then they do the most revealing thing. They explain it. They produce reasons. I liked this one because it felt more friendly. It seemed more trustworthy. The features looked cleaner. A full story appears, confident and detailed, built on top of an outcome that was never selected. That's the coherence machine in its purest form. It doesn't just explain what you did, it explains what you are now holding, what you now possess, what is now true in front of you, because the system is always trying to keep the timeline smooth. It would rather believe it chose than admit it was carried. And notice what that implies. If you can generate reasons for a choice you didn't make, then reasons can't be the foundation of control. They're a layer of interpretation, a layer that stabilizes identity after the fact, a layer that says, this is me, even when the path was determined by a swap, a default, a drift, a cue, not because the mind is broken, because coherence is cheaper than investigation. It's faster to explain than to recheck. So the system explains, and the explanation feels like truth, because it matches the current scene. The mind wants a world that makes sense, not necessarily a world that's accurate, a world that fits, a smooth narrative, cause and effect. I did X because Y. Even when Y was built after X, reason isn't always there to drive action. Reason is there to make action feel owned, to make you feel like the author, like the agent, like the controller. Ownership is a feeling, not a mechanism. Thinking doesn't control behavior, it explains behavior. And that's why the illusion is so stable, because the narration is compelling. It feels like you, it sounds like you, it uses your voice, it uses your values, it uses your identity. And because it's coherent, you trust it, even when it arrived late, even when it's incomplete, even when it's wrong. Now, here's where this becomes a problem you can't talk your way out of. Because once you see that reasoning often arrives as narration, you start noticing something else. Your mind doesn't merely explain actions. It edits the list of options before you even get to deliberate. It decides what you notice, what feels available, what feels worth doing. And that is the layer between thought and action. It's not willpower, it's not motivation. It's a selection system, a filter, a gate, a traffic controller. So what's actually sitting between intention and behavior? Here's another way to think about it. Imagine you're standing in front of 10 doors and you choose one, but you never saw the 10 doors. You only saw 2. Not because the others weren't there, because the system didn't surface them. The selection layer decided what counted as an option. And then you chose from what remained. That's how it works. You don't act on everything you want. You act on what becomes available in the moment, what becomes easy, what becomes loud, what becomes close. And that selection layer runs on a few brutal principles, not moral principles, mechanical ones. First, salience. What grabs attention wins, not what's important, what's noticeable. Second, friction. What's easier wins, not what's better, what's smoother. Third, immediate reward. What pays now wins, not what pays later, what has an instant signal. Fourth, default scripts. And notice how unromantic this is. None of these rules care about what you intended an hour ago. They don't consult your long-term beliefs. They don't open a file labeled values and check it for instructions. They respond to what is present, what is loud, what is easy, what is already in motion. That's why plans feel fragile. Not because planning is pointless, because a plan is a sentence in your head, and the selection layer is a machine reading the environment in real time. The environment provides signals, the plan provides words, and signals usually win. When attention drops, the pattern runs. Not the plan, the pattern. And you can feel this if you watch it closely. You don't do what you value most. You do what the system makes effortless in the moment. You do what's next in the queue. You do what the environment hands you. And afterward, you explain it. You turn the result into a story about your choice. That story becomes identity. And identity becomes evidence. See, that's just what I do. Even though what you did was the output of a selection system under constraints, now we can finally say what the system is doing. In plain language, you do not execute your intentions directly. You compete with a fast machine, a machine that will take the first decent option and move on. Because it has to, because the world doesn't pause while you deliberate. So the system saves deep reasoning for moments when the default fails, or when the stakes become obvious. Most of life runs on the cheaper mode: pattern matching, recognition, automatic sequence. And that is why thinking and doing feel disconnected. Because they are. Not completely, not always, but enough to create the gap you keep experiencing. Enough to make intention feel like a weak force. Enough to make I decided feel like a fragile story. Because it is. And now we can state the reframe cleanly. You've been picturing thinking as the driver, a tool you control, a lever you pull, but thinking is not the driver. Thinking is the narrator. It's the voice that explains what the system already did. Sometimes it influences, sometimes it steers, but much of the time it arrives after the selection is already made, after the option was already surfaced, after the cue already triggered the pattern. And once you see that, the model changes, not into despair, into clarity. Because the gap stops being mysterious. It becomes structural. Now, if this is real, we should be able to see it outside your own head, not in your private life, in predictable patterns across people, in choices that shift without anyone becoming smarter or dumber. Because if the selection layer is real, it should leave fingerprints. So here's proof number one. Same person, different choice, no new information, just a different frame. Imagine two statements about the same outcome. Statement A, this procedure has a 90% survival rate. Statement B, this procedure has a 10% death rate. Same math, same reality, but they don't feel the same. The mind reacts differently. One feels safer, one feels darker, and people make different choices based on which version they hear. Not because they suddenly forgot arithmetic, because the selection layer is sensitive to framing. It uses tone as a signal of risk. It treats language as information about what to do next. And so the choice shifts without new facts, without new logic. Just a different wrapper around the same numbers. Or take defaults. A form asks you to pick an option, but one option is pre-selected. Most people stick with it, not because they love it, because it's already there. It's frictionless. It feels like the path. It feels normal. So the default becomes behavior. And later, the mind narrates, I chose it. Even when the choice was mostly the absence of resistance. Even when the system simply followed the path of least friction. Same person, same values, different outcome. Because the selection layer changed what felt natural, and you called it a decision. But framing and defaults aren't the only leak. There's something even simpler, a single number, not evidence, not reasoning, just a number you saw a second ago. Imagine I ask you a question. How many countries are in Africa? Most people don't know. So the mind does what it always does in uncertainty. It searches for a handle, something stable enough to grab. Now imagine, right before you answer, you see a random number on the screen. 10 or 65. It's meaningless. You know it's meaningless. And still, your estimate shifts toward it. Not because you're irrational, because the system uses nearby information as scaffolding when it can't compute the truth. This is what thinking often is. Not deduction, not careful reasoning, but approximation under pressure. And here's the deeper move the mind makes when reality is hard. It swaps the question. It doesn't ask, what is true? It asks, what can I answer quickly? It doesn't ask what outcome is optimal. It asks, what outcome feels less risky right now? It doesn't ask what matters most. It asks, what is easiest to do next? And once the mind answers the easier question, it treats the feeling of having answered as proof. It feels like reasoning. It sounds like reasoning, but it's really substitution. The system protecting speed, protecting closure, and then conscious thought arrives and says, yes, that's what I decided. Even when what happened was simply the nearest scaffold becoming the answer. Here's the uncomfortable implication. If choices are that sensitive to framing, defaults, and random anchors, the story I am in control because I am thinking can't be fully true, because thinking isn't operating on clean facts. It's operating on surfaces, signals, cues, words, ease. And it uses those cues to decide what feels right, not what is right, what feels right. And that means your sense of control is partly an illusion created by coherence, not because you're foolish, because the system is built that way. Speed over accuracy, coherence over truth. That's the trade. But there's a second proof, even more unsettling, because it targets the thing you trust most, your certainty. You probably think confidence means something. You might not say it out loud, but it's a default belief. If you feel very sure, you're probably right. If you feel shaky, you might be wrong. That's the internal signal. Confidence is a compass. But confidence doesn't track truth the way you think it does. Confidence tracks coherence, how well the story fits, how smooth the answer feels, how quickly the mind found something that satisfied the question. And sometimes the easiest answer is wrong. Sometimes it's not even answering the real question. The mind quietly swaps the hard question for an easier one. It doesn't ask, what is true? It asks, what feels answerable right now? What fits the pattern I recognize? What would make this feel resolved? And when it finds something that clicks, you get confidence. Not because you verified it, because it clicked. That's why people can be confidently wrong. Not because they're arrogant, because the system values fluency, speed, closure, a completed shape, an answer that seals the gap. And the moment the mind gets closure, it relaxes. It stops searching. It stops checking. It stops updating. Not because it proved the answer, because it found a coherent story. So confidence is not evidence of correctness. It's evidence of coherence. It's the mind's signal that the narrative is stable enough to stop thinking. And that is why certainty can be so persuasive to you, not just to other people. You believe yourself when you feel coherent. Even when the model is wrong, now let's bring everything together. Because we can finally answer the title question directly. What's between your thoughts and your actions? It's not a mystical gap. It's not a moral weakness. It's not a missing ingredient called willpower. Between your thoughts and your actions is a selection system. And that system is optimized for speed, not truth. It's optimized to keep you moving in a complex world, to respond quickly, to conserve attention, to reduce computation, to keep the organism alive and functional. And it does that by filtering reality before conscious thought gets a vote. It decides what you notice, what feels urgent, what feels easy, what feels available. And then conscious thought steps in and narrates the outcome. This is why thinking doesn't automatically become doing. Because thinking is not the final gate. It's not the engine. It's not the control panel you assumed. It's one component inside a bigger system. A system that trades accuracy for speed, that trades truth for coherence, that trades full control for usable control. A system that says, we will not search all possibilities. We will not compute the best option. We will choose what's good enough. We will choose what's next. And we will feel like we chose it. Because feeling like the author is itself a feature. It stabilizes identity, it maintains coherence, it keeps the narrative of self intact, even when the underlying process was mostly default, even when the decision was mostly the output of friction and salience, even when the mind simply followed what was loudest, easiest, nearest. You don't act on what you believe. You act on what the system makes available. That's the real limit of control. You thought control meant force, like you could push a lever and override the system. But control in this architecture is mostly about what gets selected, what enters the 4-slot spotlight, what becomes the next obvious step. That's why the gap feels so personal. You can hear the narrator making promises, and then you watch the selection layer ignore them. And once you see this, the story breaks. You stop imagining the mind as a ruler giving orders. You start seeing it as a machine managing constraints, a machine that must compress reality, a machine that must shortcut, a machine that must default, because there isn't time to do it any other way. This is not a personal tragedy, it's architecture. The architecture of a thinking organism built to function under pressure, built to be fast enough, not perfect. And here's the final reframe. Thinking isn't a tool you control. It's a system that controls what you notice. Reason isn't designed to be right. It's designed to be fast enough. Your mind doesn't search for truth. It searches for coherence. And the fact that you can glimpse that machinery, that you can see the filter working in real time, that is one of the strangest things a mind can do. A system turning inward, trying to model itself, trying to understand the thing it's made of, not comfort, truth,